Hi, in today's session, we are going to talk about one of the key questions asked by one of our viewers. The question was, I'd like to learn how much of baking soda to use in a cake recipe. When I added baking soda instead of baking powder in a cake, it was so bad, there was a big dent in the middle and the cake was burnt. For this, we need to understand more about baking soda. Let's see what we remember about baking soda.
Is it a chemical?
Yes.
It's a white color powder. And it's also used in baking.
Of course. And what else do you remember?
We used it for making volcano. We also used it for doing that balloon experiment.
Very good.
We also used it for acid-base reaction and lots of other science products. Other science experiments.
That's right. Almost all those experiments we did were based on the acid-base reaction. When we added vinegar or a lemon juice to baking soda, there was some kind of a reaction that happened and carbon dioxide gas started escaping, giving out all those bubbles. That is what happens even during baking a cake. In baking terms, this is called leavening or raising. Leavening is nothing but the bubbly reaction that happens that softens or lightens the texture of the cake. And the substances that help with leavening are called leavening agents. So now we know that baking soda is a leavening agent and it gives texture. What we also should know is that it reacts to heat. Baking soda, when it's heated, it also gives out carbon dioxide. Here is a quick experiment where we have added boiling water to baking soda. There is a very quick bubbly reaction and the bubbles are the carbon dioxide escaping. The minute we add some boiling water to the baking soda, a reaction happens. This reaction is slightly different from that of when an acidic ingredient is added. Here, along with carbon dioxide, there is another salt that is formed, which is called sodium carbonate. Do you know where sodium carbonate is used? Yes, in soaps and detergents. Sodium carbonate is also called washing soda. The same reaction happens when baking soda is heated as it is. Carbon dioxide gets emitted and water is in the form of vapor and we get sodium carbonate as the salt. There is another interesting experiment called the Vanishing Salt Experiment. We'll provide more details in the description below. Let's try to compare this with the acid-base reaction. Here are two such equations of when an acidic ingredient reacts with baking soda. We don't have to remember all the details, but it is just to give an idea. When baking soda and vinegar are mixed up, we get some carbon dioxide, water, and a salt called sodium acetate. Same way, when baking soda is mixed with lemon juice, the resulting products are more or less the same except for the salt. Here the salt is sodium citrate. Usually, acid-base reactions are called neutralization reactions. So the resulting salt is going to be neutral or mildly acidic or mildly basic. So we need the acidic ingredient to balance the taste of the cake. If we do not have an acidic ingredient, sodium carbonate is going to result, which is very alkaline in nature, and our cake is going to have a very weird soapy taste. Now that we understand the difference between an acid-base reaction and just the base reacting to heat, baking soda can be defined as a basic substance or an alkaline ingredient that needs an acidic ingredient or some heat to make those bubbles to make our cakes fluffier. And for our cakes to not taste metallic or soapy, it needs an acidic ingredient to balance. That leads us to another question. So what happens if we add too much acid and very less baking soda? It is going to taste slightly acidic. And not only that, it is also not going to have enough carbon dioxide escaping to give us the correct texture. The cake might be dense. On the other hand, what happens if we use too much of baking soda? We saw how immediately the baking soda reacted to hot water, right? Same way, the reaction is going to be much faster and the cake will start rising faster and more bubbles start escaping and suddenly it will start sinking in the middle. and we wouldn't have enough acid to react with it. So with the sodium carbonate that's formed, our cake is going to have a very soapy or an alkaline taste. Another interesting aspect is that baking soda enhances Maillard reaction. I hope you remember Maillard reaction from our previous sessions. So this makes the cake brown faster. Of course, there are various other reasons why the cake browns faster or why the cake gets burnt, including the oven temperature. But here today we are going to talk only about the leavening agent. So the next question is, how much of baking soda should I use? Experts recommend us to add for every 1 cup of flour 1/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda. And this 1/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda is enough to react with half a cup of acidic ingredient. Let's take an example of a basic vanilla cake. Here I have taken an example of an eggless cake. We will come to eggs and substitution of eggs later on. For now, what we have is 1.5 cups of flour, 1 cup of curd. So to neutralize this 1 cup of curd, we will need half a teaspoon of baking soda. Remember we mentioned the rule was 1 cup of flour needs 1/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda. So here we have 1.5 cups, which will actually require a little less than half a teaspoon of baking soda. So this quantity should work fine. Let us wait before we follow this recipe to make a vanilla cake. We will understand more in a short while. What about baking powder? That is the next part of today's session. Baking powder is nothing but a mixture of baking soda, an acid and a starch. Baking powder is usually used when there are non-acidic ingredients present in our recipe. There is already a weak acid component present in it, so that it neutralizes the alkaline taste. So we don't have to worry about adding an extra acidic ingredient. But having one doesn't impact much. So how much of baking powder should we use? For every cup of flour, we can use 1 teaspoon of baking powder. So now we understand the difference, right? So how about substitution? The general idea is to try not to substitute. We can plan the recipe in advance and make sure that we have either the baking soda or baking powder in hand before proceeding. But usually it doesn't work that way, right? So in case if you have baking powder but the recipe demands baking soda or vice versa, what should we do? From what we have understood, we can quickly convert and say that every 1 teaspoon of baking powder can be substituted with 1/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda. But remember, we have to add an acidic ingredient to avoid the metallic taste. This 1/4 of a teaspoon can go up to 1/3 of a teaspoon also. To substitute baking soda with baking powder, 1 teaspoon of baking soda can be replaced by 3 teaspoons of baking powder. But please try not to substitute and let's try to stick to the recipe given. And how about some of the recipes using both baking soda and baking powder? They are used in order to give an extra fluffiness. So for example, here is another basic vanilla cake, the same one, except you can see one more component added, which is 1 teaspoon of baking powder. Since baking powder doesn't need any extra acidic ingredient, this 1 teaspoon along with the acid-base reaction of baking soda and curd is going to give us a fluffy, spongy vanilla cake. Here is an example of replacing the baking soda with baking powder with minute changes in the ingredients. So here we are using milk instead of curd and the acidic ingredient is optional. This is a basic vanilla cake recipe that is available in several books and blogs. So we have used it here to give an idea. That brings us to the end of today's session. But there is still a lot more to learn about leavening agents, which we will keep learning as we experiment. Thank you so much for asking this question. Hope it helps. If you have any other question, please feel free to write to us. In the description box below, you will find a link where you can ask any questions and also record any of your comments and suggestions.
Hope you had fun. Thank you. Bye. See you in the next session.